And I'll request Sanjay ji to read How to Love God. Is it showing up?
Yeah, just a minute. I have something in my mouth.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Or I can get
Just few seconds.
Sure. Sorry about that. I should have noticed.
Yeah. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
How to love God. To love God in the most practical way is to love our fellow beings. If we feel for others in the same way as we feel for our own dear ones, we love God. If instead of seeing faults in others, we look within ourselves, we are loving God. If instead of robbing others to help ourselves, we rob ourselves to help others, we are loving God. If we suffer in the suffering of others and feel happy in the happiness of others, we are loving God. If instead of worrying our own misfortunes, we think ourselves more fortunate than many, many others, we are loving God. If we endure our lot with patience and contentment, accepting it as His will, we are loving God. If we understand and feel that the greatest act of devotion and worship to God is not to hurt or harm any of His beings, we are loving God. To love God as He ought to be loved, we must live for God and die for God, knowing that the goal of life is to love God and find Him as our own self. Jai Meher Baba.
Jai Meher Baba.
Jai Baba.
So I will just tell you briefly where we are on the reading, so that you know. So if you see, there are part 6 and part 7 that are pending. Part 6 is consciousness and samskaras. We finished samskaras. There's just 2 chapters, God and the individual, and beginning and the end of creation, which I think we will finish today, which will conclude part 6. And then we have part 7, which is the last part. And in number of pages, it's about 60 odd pages that we have left of the book. The book itself is about 400 pages of readable core text, non-glossary, non-intro style text. Okay, with that, I will go to yesterday's assignment that Kama gave. So how many of you were able to work on that assignment? It's a beautiful assignment, by the way. Silence is not good.
Okay. What aspect are you talking about?
Yeah. So he gave us an assignment of reading through that analogy again, which we read yesterday, and trying to make sense of it. It was the analogy of the washing of the vessels, right? So is that right, Kamal?
Jai Baba, yes. I think one slight correction. Probably I mentioned that maybe we could discuss this during the weekend.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's
so
fine
you're
as
right.
well.
I think that is something to be discussed, but I believe due to lack of time, it would have been difficult for everybody to dwell on that,
Yeah, so that given what happened overnight, let's leave it for the weekend. But guys, I will probably put out the page number of the text. Please read it. I am lost. Okay, so
Yeah.
I know when Kama
I think I read it and I think I understood. I read
Great.
it.
We'll
I
talk
think
on
I
the weekend.
understood, but maybe.
Yeah.
Disclaimer: I'm only limited soul, so.
All of us are, aren't we? So
if
Karthik, can I say
Kama
something?
can put, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, Sanjay. I mean Ashok, then Sanjay.
Yeah. I'll just take a couple of ones, maybe just a minute. I was reading it through again, and there is talk about surrender and obedience.
Mm-hmm.
And what comes to my mind is that, Dr. Gadekar, in one of his talks he gave us, he mentioned that Baba had told him specifically on 3 or 4 things to do when he was going to Berkeley for his higher studies.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that number one, you will not touch non-veg food, you will not touch wine, not a drop of wine, and you will not touch any lady, as in like in a lusty way, or to as treat everybody as your sister abroad. And fourth was write me a letter every week about your welfare. And he religiously is to write a letter. And when I went there, I saw that there's a red box in which he's to post the letter. So, I mean, we learned from him that complete surrender and complete obedience, and he used to do it religiously, regularly, write a letter. I just thought I'll share this with the group.
Oh,
That's
okay,
wonderful.
Baba.
Yeah, Sanjay.
Jai Baba.
Great, Ashok. Thank you, Sanjay.
I just wanted.
Sorry.
I just wanted Kamaji to put the assignment on the group.
Chat.
Yeah, chat.
Sure.
Yeah. Jai Baba.
Yeah, I'll do that. This is Kama.
Yeah.
Ashok, please don't mind my observation of what you just said. One is that, as we know from reading the discourses, everyone's sanskaras are unique. So the instruction that Baba gave to Dr. Gadekar is a one-on-one based on Gadekar's sanskaras. Equally, on the other hand, suppose I had gone to Baba, let's say hypothetically, he would have told me to do the opposite, So just wonder on that, because there are certain analogies where there are some stories about how a perfect master tells a person who seems to be so-called spiritual, but actually tells him to do certain things that are considered morally wrong. But only a perfect master knows exactly what the sanskaras are. And to balance the sanskaras, you might have to obey certain orders which might seem immoral. That was my point. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba, fair point. I agree. Agreed.
Great. So with that, let's go to the reading. The chapter is God and the Individual. It's number 16, page number 16 on the physical book, and I have it on screen. So God is the only reality. God is infinite. He's beyond the opposites of good and bad, right and wrong, virtue and vice, birth and death, pleasure and suffering. Such dual aspects do not belong to God. If you take God as one separate entity, he becomes one term in relational existence. Just as good is the counterpart of bad, God becomes the counterpart of not God, and the infinite becomes to be looked upon as the opposite of finite. When you talk on the infinite and the finite, you're referring to them as two, and the infinite has already become the second part of the duality. But the infinite belongs to the non-dual order of being. If the infinite is looked upon as the counterpart of the finite, it is strictly speaking no longer infinite, but a species of the finite, for it stands outside the finite as its opposite and is thus limited. Since the infinite cannot be the second part of the finite, the apparent existence of the finite is false. The infinite alone exists. God cannot be brought down to the domain of duality. There is only one being in reality, and it is the universal soul. The existence of the finite or the limited is only apparent or imaginary. Very powerful paragraph, and I think it's profound. Apparent existence of the finite. You are infinite. You are really everywhere, but you think that you are the body and therefore consider yourself limited. If you think you are the body which is sitting, you do not know your true nature. If you were to look within and experience your soul in its true nature, you would realize that you are infinite and beyond all creation. However, you identify yourself with the body. This false identification is due to ignorance, which makes itself effective through the medium of the mind. An ordinary person thinks that he is the physical body. A spiritually advanced individual thinks that he is the subtle body. The saint thinks he is the mind, but in none of them is the soul having direct self-knowledge. It is not a case of pure thinking unmixed with illusion. The soul, is infinite, aloof from mind or body, yet owing to ignorance. The soul comes under the sway of the mind and becomes a thinker, sometimes identifying itself with the body and sometimes with the mind. From the limited point of view of a person who has not gone beyond the domain of Maya, there are numberless individuals. It seems that there are as many individuals as there are minds and bodies. In fact, there is only one universal soul, but the individual thinks that he is different from other individuals. The one and the same soul is ultimately behind the minds of seemingly different individuals, and through them it has the multifarious experiences of duality. The one in the many comes to experience itself as one of the many. This is due to imagination or false thinking. That's a nice line. The one in the many comes to experience itself as one of the many. Cause of false thinking. Thinking becomes false because of the interference of samskaras accumulated during the process of the evolution of consciousness. The function of consciousness is perverted by the operation of samskaras, which manifest themselves as desires. Through many lives, consciousness is continually being burdened by the after effects of experience. The perception of the soul is limited by these after effects. The thinking of the soul cannot break through the hedge created by samskaras, and consciousness becomes a helpless captive of illusions projected by its own false thinking. This falsification of thought is present not only in cases where the consciousness is partly developed, but also in man where it is fully developed. Scope of full consciousness. The progressive evolution of consciousness from the stone stage culminates in man. The history of evolution is the history of a gradual development of consciousness. The fruit of evolution is the full consciousness which is characteristic of man. But even this full consciousness is like a mirror covered by dust. Owing to the operation of samskaras, it does not yield clear and true knowledge of the nature of the soul. Though fully developed, it yields not truth but imaginative construction, since its free functioning is hindered by the weight of the samskaras. Moreover, it cannot extend beyond the cage created by its desires and therefore is limited in its scope. Individualization of consciousness. The boundary in which consciousness can move is prescribed by the samskaras, and the functioning of consciousness is also determined by the desires. As desires aim at self-satisfaction, the whole consciousness becomes self-centered and individualized. The individualization of consciousness may, in a sense, be said to be the effect of the vortex of desires. The soul gets enmeshed in the desires and cannot step out of the circumscribed individuality constituted by these desires. It imagines these barriers and becomes self-hypnotized. It looks upon itself as being limited and separate from other individuals. It gets entangled in individualistic existence and imagines a world of manifold separateness composed of many individuals with their respective minds and bodies. Separateness exists only in imagination. When the rays of the sun are made to pass through a prism, they get dispersed and become separate because of the refraction. If each of these rays had consciousness, it would consider itself as being separate from the other rays, forgetting entirely that at the source and on the other side of the prism, it had no separate existence. In the same way, the one being descends into the domain of Maya and assumes a multiplicity that does not in fact exist. The separateness of individuals does not exist in reality, but only in imagination. The one universal soul imagines separateness in itself, and out of this division there arises the thought of I and mine as opposed to you and yours. Although the soul is in reality an undivided and absolute unity, it appears as being manifold and divided owing to the working of its own imagination. Imagination is not a reality. Even if in its highest flight, it is a departure from truth. It is anything but the truth. The experience the soul gathers in terms of the individualized ego is all imagination. It is a misapprehension of the soul. Out of the imagination of the universal soul are born many individuals. This is Maya or ignorance. Objective universe is the title. Side by side with the birth of the separate and limited individuality, there also comes into existence the objective universe. As the limited individuality has separate existence, not in fact but only in imagination, the objective universe also has no independent and separate reality. It is the one universal self appearing in the second role of manifestation through these attributes. When the soul descends into the domain of Maya, it takes upon itself the limitations of manifold existence. This self-limitation of the soul might be looked upon as its self-sacrifice on the altar of consciousness. Although it eternally remains the same infinite absolute, it suffers a kind of timeless contraction through its apparent descent into the world of time, variety, and evolution. What really evolves, however, is not the soul itself, but only the consciousness which becomes, because of its limitations, gives rise to the limited individuality. Triple entanglement and duality. The history of the limited individuality is a history of the development of a triple entanglement with mind, energy, and matter. Duality prevails in all these domains, and the soul gets entangled therein. Although it is in essence beyond duality, duality implies the existence of opposites limiting and balancing each other through mutual tension. Good and bad, virtue and vice are examples of such opposites. The ignorant soul enmeshed in duality is in the clutches of both good and bad. The duality of good and bad arises due to ignorance, but once entangled with it, the soul comes under its sway. During the evolution of the triple entanglement with matter, body, energy, and mind, the ignorant soul is continually in the grip of wanting. It wants the good and bad of the gross world. It wants the good and the bad of the subtle world. And it wants the good and the bad of the mental world. And owing to this distinction of good and bad, wanting itself becomes good and bad. Wanting thus comes to be inevitably limited by the perpetual tension of the opposites. This gives rise to unending oscillation from one state to another without arriving at the unlimited state, which can only be discovered in the unchanging, eternal aspect of life. The infinite is to be sought beyond the domain of duality. This becomes possible only when consciousness can emerge from the limited individuality by breaking through the barriers of samskaras. Chasm between consciousness and unconsciousness. That's the title. We have seen that the possible field of consciousness is limited by the samskaras. This limitation creates a division of the human psyche into two parts. One part falls within the range of consciousness and the other part falls beyond it. The unconscious part, in its full extent, is identical with the power that is behind matter. It is referred to as God by the orthodox religions. The ultimate reality, which is symbolically represented through such concepts, can be known fully only by bringing the unconscious into consciousness. An extension of consciousness consists in being conscious of that which was formerly a part of the unconscious. The progressive conquest of the unconscious by the conscious culminates in consummate consciousness, which is unlimited in scope and unhindered in function. Between this highest state of consciousness and the limited, though full consciousness of average humanity, there are about 49 degrees of illumined consciousness. They mark the important stages of growing illumination.
I think it's a good time to take a pause. This last paragraph, sure. Maybe if somebody can throw some more light, Kamaji.
Agreed.
Short comments, anything. It's very heavy.
Yeah. Yes. I totally agree. I was thinking of exactly the same.
Yeah.
Kama?
Yeah, I would suggest that you also read the next paragraph because both are connected.
Okay.
And then I will give the explanations.
Jai Baba.
We'll stop after that. Spiritual advancement. The gulf between the clouded consciousness of average humanity and the fully illumined consciousness of a perfect master is created by samskaras that give rise to egoism. These can be removed through perfect character, devotion, and selfless service. But the best results in this direction are attained through the help of a perfect master. Spiritual advancement consists not in the further development of consciousness, for it is already fully developed in man, but in the emancipation of consciousness from the bondage of samskaras. Although, in essence, consciousness is the same in all the different stages of existence, it can never be consummate unless it can reflect the knowledge of infinity without the least shadow of ignorance, and also cover the whole extent of creation, illumining the different spheres of existence. Yeah,
Jai Baba,
come over to you.
Yeah. So, Sanjay ji, that is a very, very beautiful question. I think it's one of the most important concepts which took me a long time to understand. I wouldn't say I've captured it completely, but in the beginning, I would say that this will also be another assignment for all of us for the weekend, because I won't be able to throw light in 2 or 3 minutes, but I will give you a hint. When you look at consciousness, there is, see, this is again the ambiguity of the English language. There is consciousness, which is called Chaitanya, and there is something called conscious and being unconscious, and also subconscious. Now, in the funny part about the English language, in the dictionary, if I'm not mistaken, the word unconscious and subconscious have the same meaning. So I'm going to ask you guys to really dwell on these three aspects: consciousness, the word conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. Now, what I've understood here is that a perfect master basically doesn't go to sleep technically the way we do. You must have heard of a lot of instances of Baba, just getting up. Baba's thinking that Baba is snoring, he's not asleep. So what happens to a perfect master is that their consciousness overlaps the subconsciousness. So actually the word consciousness, there are two parts: conscious consciousness and subconscious consciousness. That is how I relate to the word consciousness. This is a very, very confusing paragraphs because they are not using, and if you remember in God Speaks, there is no word called consummate consciousness. It's only in discourses. Okay. And the second thing is that, so I will leave it here basically. So in summary, and I will have to also point out to Sanjay ji that in the Hindi discourses, the lady who translated, I had asked this question: why in the Hindi discourses you are using the same word Chetana for consciousness and conscious? So I'm not a Hindi expert, but I asked her, so I'm going to leave it that way. So the difference is Chetana is conscious, Chaitanya is consciousness. So this will be a very good homework to dwell on. Jai Baba.
Thank you.
Can any inputs regarding that 49 degrees referred to?
Yeah.
I think we had discussed this at Karthik. There was a book written by this lady. She was Shamak Davar, the whatever his he's in the Bollywood profession of whatever you call it.
Bhavnagri.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And her book called Spirit something.
Spirits
Yeah.
of the, Secrets of the
Laws
Spirit
of the
World.
Spirit World.
Sharandeep also read it. She mentioned
Now,
it in her
based on my
report.
understanding, where people have been talking about auto writing and where the famous book Sounds of Silence by Nan Umbriger, which has brought a lot of people to the Baba fold because of losing their beloved ones, Bhavanagari's book actually is the original, but it used to be cyclostyled and unofficially passed around. And if I'm not mistaken, Nan Umrigar met Bhavanagari, and that's how she was able to connect to, her son. So my point there is that in that book of hers, she mentions the 49 degrees. So we know there are 7 planes of involution. So in each plane, there are subplanes. So in a mathematical sense, you can think of 7 different planes in each of the plane, but I'm not sure about this. Okay, so let me be very clear about that. So that's how you can interpret 49 degrees, because as you know, in physics and maths, we are all information theory, IT, in a very clinical sense, because we have a unique DNA, and a DNA is a unique number. So in that regard, you can look at that as 49 degrees of freedom. So Baba has said in God Speaks, when you look at all the mass, and also when you look at the spiritual hierarchy in the 7,000 number of people, he has talked about people who are between planes. So, so this is what I can describe. Thank you, Jai Baba.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's useful. By the way, confession,
That
I
makes
just
sense.
know
Yeah.
about the book, but I have not read it. I know Sujini Aunty has it. Maybe I'll go. If I can find the reference, I'll bring it out and share it for everybody. So
Thanks.
then I will continue.
So,
Assignment, 2 assignments that are active. I'll probably summarize on the chat.
ash removing grease is the number 1 assignment.
Yeah.
Second is today's. Okay.
The 2 paras and understanding
Conscious of being conscious of the unconscious.
Correct.
And one more addition I would make is, please, if possible, give some practical examples related to those 2 concepts, related to oneself or even others, whatever you have read about or heard about. That would be nice to understand the concept. Jai Baba.
Okay.
Can I ask a dumb question? What is weekend means? Friday, Saturday, or Sunday?
Saturday and Sunday. So for you, it means Friday night and Saturday night.
Thank you.
Yeah. Deep sleep. Every time you go to sleep, you're unconsciously united with the infinite reality. This unification involves the extension of unconsciousness over consciousness. It thus bridges over the chasm between the unconscious and the conscious. But being unconscious of this union, you do not consciously derive any benefit from it. This is the reason why, when you wake up again from deep sleep, you become aware of the self, same humdrum individual, and you begin to act and experience exactly as you acted and experienced before going to sleep. If your union with the Supreme Reality had been a conscious union, you would have awakened into a completely new and infinitely rich life. Conscious union with infinite reality. A perfect master is consciously united with the infinite reality. In his case, the chasm between consciousness and unconsciousness is bridged, but not by the extension of the unconscious over the conscious, as with the person who enjoys deep sleep, but by the extension of consciousness over unconsciousness. The waxing and waning of consciousness is applicable only to the limited individual. In the case of the perfect master, the conquest of the unconscious by the conscious is final and permanent, and therefore his state of self-knowledge is continuous and unbroken and remains the same at all times without any diminution. From this you can see that the perfect master never sleeps in the ordinary sense of the word. When he rests his body, he experiences no gap in his consciousness. State of perfection. In the state of perfection, full consciousness becomes consummate by the disappearance of all obstacles to illumination. The conquest of the unconscious by the conscious is complete, and the person continuously dwells in the full blaze of illumination, or as one with illumination. He becomes illumination itself. As long as a person remains under the sway of duality and looks upon manifold experience as being true and final, he has not traversed the domain of ignorance. In the state of final understanding, a person realizes that the infinite, which is one without a second, is the only reality. The infinite pervades and includes all existence, leaving nothing as its rival. A person who has such realization has attained the highest state of consciousness. In this state, the full consciousness, which is the fruit of evolution, is retained. But the limitations of samskaras and desires are completely transcended. The limited individuality, which is the creation of ignorance, is transformed into the divine individuality, which is unlimited. The illimitable consciousness of the universal soul becomes individualized in this focus without giving rise to any form of illusion. The person is free from all self-centered desires, and he becomes the medium of the spontaneous flow of the supreme and universal will, which expresses divinity. Individuality becomes limitless by disappearance of ignorance, as it is unimpaired by the separateness of Maya and unentangled in its duality. It enjoys the state of liberation in which there is objectless awareness, pure being, and unclouded joy. Such a person has no longer any of the illusions that perplex and bewilder man. In one sense, he is dead. The personal ego, which is the source of the sense of separateness, has been forever annihilated. But in another sense, he is alive forevermore with unconquerable love and eternal bliss. He has infinite power and wisdom, and the whole universe is to him a field for his spiritual work of perfecting mankind. So, with that, we come to the end of God and the individual. Any questions, comments other than those that we deferred to the assignment?
Jai Baba Karthik. I want to
Yeah.
share something here.
Sure.
Now, this is again a little bit of my personal learning from having studied neuroscience.
Sure.
I think I'm going to relate a little bit more to the process here. So something like spirituality is very abstract. Now, the normal way a brain functions is that the frontal lobe of the brain can only process 5 or 7 thoughts. And many times we'll find that when we are working on multiple things, we become what the psychologists will call as crowded. Thoughts become crowded. At that point, we feel overwhelmed. So that's if we train ourselves in the right way, we can use our subconscious mind very effectively. So many times you can give it questions and wait for the answers to come. And the subconscious mind has got this capability. As an example, sometimes you might be just listening to an audio and you fall asleep, but then a lot of that audio actually goes to your subconscious mind. So this is what I have understood a little bit. And during meditation practice, or even otherwise, even in our waking state, it is possible to use the subconscious mind very effectively, which almost has 93% of our brain capacity. Thank you. Jai Baba.
Wow.
It's very reassuring, even if you are not understanding some of the parts of the discourses, it at least going into our mind. Yeah, Baba.
No, but that statistic was remarkable. 93% of the mind is.
One more thing you'll probably experience this is when the brain makes a connection. Our neurons, it has got the capacity to regenerate. I think Dr. Ravi can bear me out. And what happens is you experience a buzz, like an electrical thing. So when we have an insight or an aha moment, at that point, the brain rewires itself. So sometimes when we have a better understanding of something, this happens to us. You will experience like a small electrical spark.
Okay. A Baba
Very,
bus.
very welcome information. I feel very happy about this.
Incidentally, the two people on the video right now are both doctors. So, Dr. Ravi, just for the record.
Actually, I'm a physicist in radiation oncology, so
Okay.
I deal with hippocampus. I done some research on
Oh, exactly.
hippocampus, how the pot usage in America, how it's affecting and how the cancer affected people are getting more affected with the radiation. That's about my brain knowledge a little bit. I studied brain anatomy and physiology, but it's long time. I deal only with the cancer patients, so sorry about. But I understand what you're saying, Ranganathji. That was very, very encouraging.
Indeed. So if there's no other questions, we'll continue with the reading.
Well, one more thing, Karthik. Somebody
Sure.
was mentioning about perfect masters not sleeping. I read somewhere, was it Lord Meher? Help me if anybody else read it. The perfect masters, even the God realized people with the human body, they need about 20 minutes of sleep every day. I do not know about Baba, but perfect masters or God realized people need about 20 or 22 minutes of sleep every day.
Wow. I've not come across
Yeah.
that. Anybody has, please bring the reference. And if it comes up due to your subconscious mind later, post it on the chat. So with that, we go to, yeah.
Karthik, this is Kama.
Yeah.
Jai Baba wants one additional thought on what Ranga just mentioned. It reminded me of there is something in yoga called Yoga Nidra. And this Yoga Nidra was popularized by Swami Satyananda Saraswati of the Bihar School of Yoga, Mongir, Bihar, who was a disciple of Swami Shivananda in Rishikesh.
Yeah.
And interestingly, when Satyananda Saraswati, the founder, decided to give up his, heading the yoga thing, he had adopted the second, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old son of a couple disciple, and he nurtured him, and he became the head of the Bihar School of Yoga. He's quite young. I think he's probably now in the early 60s, but he's also kind of resigned and he's doing sadhana, and that's another person. The point I wanted to make was that this particular boy grew up with Satyananda Saraswati, and every day Satyananda would experiment with Yoga Nidra. And this chap learned many languages, all the yoga, different types of yoga and everything. And he was sent to America probably between the age of 18 or 21. And he headed the Bihar School of Yoga branches in America for almost 15, 20 years at a very young age. He didn't have a formal education and nothing. So what Ranga said is a very, very powerful concept called Yoga Nidra, actually. That is the terminology for what he just mentioned. So there's a lot of literature on that. I just wanted to mention that. Jai Baba.
Great. Thank you.
It's if I may add, it's very effective. I practice it on a regular basis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
It's a Yoga Nidra is in between awake state and deep sleep state. So it's kind of a maybe Namita ji can expound on that. But what effectiveness is there? I kind of fail to understand that.
You feel very calm, rejuvenated, and it gives you, power packed time with yourself. And when you wake out of it, you are as fresh as a lily. Try it. I'll send you a link. You try and that's it. Jai Baba.
Thank you. Sure,
Jai
Jim.
Baba, I think a more modern way to think about it is power naps. If you take a
Yeah.
power nap for 7 minutes, you can actually rejuvenate a lot of your energy.
Yes, something like that.
Wow, 7. I've tried 20. So 20
Yeah.
works very well for
Yeah,
me.
for me also it works
I
very
should
well.
try 7. I should try 7 next time. 20 works a charm for me. Anyway,
Jai Baba.
Page is Physical Book 23, The Beginning and the End of Creation. Whence and whither. As long as the human mind does not directly experience ultimate reality as it is, the mind is baffled in every attempt to explain the origin and purpose of creation. The ancient past seems to be shrouded in inscrutable mystery, and the future seems to be a completely sealed book. The human mind can at best make brilliant conjectures about the past and the future of the universe because it is bound by the spell of Maya. It can neither arrive at final knowledge of these points, nor can it remain content with ignorance about them. Whence and whither are the two everlasting and poignant queries that make the human mind divinely restless. Beginning and end. The human mind cannot reconcile itself to infinite regress in its search for the origin of the world, nor can it reconcile itself to endless change without a goal. Evolution is unintelligible if it has no initial cause, and it is deprived of all direction and meaning if it all does not lead to a terminus. The very questions whence and whither presuppose the beginning and the end of this evolving creation. The beginning of evolution is the beginning of time, and the end of evolution is the end of time. Evolution has both beginning and end, because time has both beginning and end. Between the beginning and the end of this changing world, there are many cycles, but there is, in and through these cycles, a continuity of cosmic evolution. The real termination of the evolutionary process is called Mahapralaya, or the great annihilation of the world, when the world becomes what it was in the beginning, namely nothing. The Mahapralaya of the world may be compared with the sleep of a person. Just as the varied world of experience completely disappears for the individual who is in deep sleep, the entire objective cosmos, which is the creation of Maya, vanishes into nothingness at the time of Mahapralaya. It is as if the universe had never existed at all. Reality is timeless and absolute. Even during the evolutionary period, the universe is in itself nothing but imagination. There is in fact only one indivisible and eternal reality, and it has neither beginning nor end. It is beyond time. From the point of view of this timeless reality, the whole time process is purely imaginary. And the billions of years that have passed and the billions of years that are to pass do not have even the value of a second. It is as if they had not existed at all. So the manifold and evolving universe cannot be said to be a real outcome of this one reality. If it were an outcome of this one reality, reality would be either a relative term or a composite being, which it is not. The one reality is absolute. Reality and nothing. The one reality includes in itself all existence. It is everything, but it has nothing as its shadow. The idea of all-inclusive existence implies that it leaves nothing outside its being. When you analyze the idea of being, you arrive by implication at the idea of that which does not exist. I'll read that again. When you analyze the idea of being, you arrive by implication at the idea of that which does not exist. This idea of non-existence or nothing helps you to define clearly your notion of being. The complementary aspect of being is thus non-being or nothing. But nothing cannot be looked upon as having its own separate and independent existence. It is nothing in itself, nor can it in itself be a cause of anything. The manifold and evolving universe cannot be the outcome of nothing taken by itself. And you have seen that it also cannot be the outcome of the one reality. How then does the manifold and evolving universe arise? The manifold evolving universe arises from the mixing of the one reality and nothing. It springs out of nothing when this nothing is taken against the background of the one reality. But this should not be taken to mean that the universe is partly the outcome of the one reality or that it has an element of reality. The title is Reality and the Universe. It is an outcome of nothing and is nothing. It only seems to have existence. Its apparent existence is due to the one reality which is, as it were, behind the nothing. When nothing is added to the one reality, the result is the manifold and evolving universe. The one reality, which is infinite and absolute, does not thereby suffer any modification. It is absolute and is as such entirely unaffected by any addition or subtraction. The one reality remains what it was, complete and absolute in itself and unconcerned and unconnected with the panorama of creation that springs out of nothing. This nothing might be compared to the value of zero in mathematics. In itself, it has no positive value, but when it is added to another number, it gives rise to the many. In the many way, the manifold and evolving universe springs out of nothing when it is combined with the one reality. Imagined division between self and environment. The whole evolutionary process is within the domain of imagination. When in imagination, the one ocean of reality gets apparently disturbed, there arises the manifold world of separate centers of consciousness. This involves the basic division of life into the self and the not self, or the I and its environment. Owing to the falseness and the incompleteness of this limited self, which is only an imagined part of a really indivisible totality, consciousness cannot remain content with eternal identification with it. Thus, consciousness is trapped in ceaseless restlessness, forcing it to attempt identification with the not self. That portion of the not self or the environment with which consciousness succeeds in identifying itself gets affiliated with the self in the form of mind. And that portion of the not self with which it does not succeed in identifying itself becomes the irreducible environment that inevitably creates a limit and an opposition to the self. Thus, consciousness arrives not at the termination of its limiting duality, but at its transformation. As long as consciousness is subject to the working of vitiating imagination, it cannot successfully put an end to this duality. All the varied attempts it makes for the assimilation of the not self or the environment result merely in the replacement of the initial duality by other innumerable novel forms of the same duality. The acceptance and the rejection of certain portions of the environment express themselves respectively as wanting and not wanting, thus giving rise to the opposites of pleasure and pain, good and bad, and so forth. But neither acceptance nor rejection can lead to freedom from duality, and consciousness therefore finds itself engaged in ceaseless oscillation from one opposite to the other. The entire process of the evolution of the individual is characterized by this oscillation between the opposites. Thorough determinism of samskaras. The evolution of the limited individual is completely determined by the samskaras accumulated by him through ages. And though it is all part of imagination, the determinism is thorough and automatic. Every action and experience, howsoever ephemeral, leaves behind it an impression in the mental body. This impression is an objective modification of the mental body. And as the mental body remains the same, the impressions accumulated by the individual are capable of persisting through several lives. When the samskaras thus accumulated begin to express themselves, instead of merely lying latent in the mental body, they are experienced as desires. That is, they are apprehended as being subjected. The objective and the subjective are the two aspects of samskaras. The former is a passive state of latency, and the latter is an active state of manifestation. Through the active phase, the accumulated samskaras determine each experience and action of the limited self. Just as several feet of film have to pass in a cinema to show a brief action on the screen, many samskaras are often involved in determining a single action of the limited self. Through such expression and fulfillment in experience, the samskaras get spent up. The weak samskaras are spent up mentally. The stronger ones are spent up subtly in the form of desires and imaginative experience. And those samskaras that are powerful are spent up physically by expressing themselves through bodily action. Though the spending up of samskaras is going on continually, it does not end in freedom from samskaras, because new samskaras are inevitably being created, not only through fresh actions, but even through the very process of spending up. So the load of samskaras goes on increasing, and the individual finds himself helpless before the problem of throwing off the burden. The samskaras deposited by specific actions and experiences render the mind susceptible to similar actions and experience. But after a certain point is reached, this tendency is checked and counteracted by a natural reaction consisting in a complete changeover to its direct opposite, making room for the operation of opposite samskaras. Very often, the two opposites form parts of one and the same chain of imagination. For example, a person might first experience that he is a famous writer with wealth, fame, family, and all the agreeable things of life, and later in the same life might experience that he has lost his wealth, fame, family, and all the agreeable things of life. Sometimes it seems that a chain of imagination does not contain both the opposites in the same lifetime. For instance, a man might experience throughout his life that he is a powerful king always, victorious in battles. In this case, he has to balance this experience by the experience of defeats or the like in the next life, taking one more life to complete his chain of imagination. The purely psychological compulsion of the samskaras is thus subject to the deeper need of the soul to know itself. Example of killing. Suppose a person has killed someone in this life. This deposits in his mental body the samskaras of killing. If consciousness were to be solely and simply determined by this initial tendency created by these samskaras, he would go on killing others again and again ad infinitum, each time gathering further momentum from subsequent acts of the same kind. There would be no escape from this recurring determinism were it not for the fact that the logic of experience provides a necessary check to it. The person soon realizes the incompleteness of the experience of one opposite, and he unconsciously seeks to restore the lost balance by going over to the other opposite. Thus, the individual who has had the experience of killing will develop the psychological need and susceptibility for getting killed. In killing another person, he has appreciated only one portion of the total situation in which he is a party, namely the part of killing. The complementary half of the total situation, that is the role of being killed, remains for him ununderstood and foreign, though it nevertheless has introduced itself into his experience. There thus arises the need to complete the experience by attracting to oneself the opposite of what one has personally gone through. And consciousness has a tendency to fulfill this new and pressing need. A person who has killed will soon develop a tendency to get himself killed in order to cover the entire situation by personal experience. The question that crops up here is, who would arise to kill him in the next life? It may be the same person who was killed in the previous life, or it may be some other person with similar samskaras. As a result of action and interaction between individuals, there come into existence sanskaric links or ties. And when the individual is a new physical body, it may be among those who have previous samskaric ties or among those who have similar samskaras. But the adjustment of life is such as to make possible the free play of evolving duality. Through opposites to beyond opposites. Like the shuttle of the weaver's loom, the human mind moves within two extremes, developing the warp and the woof of the cloth of life. The development of spiritual life is best represented not as a straight line, but as a zigzag course. Take the function of the two banks of a river. If there were no banks, the waters of the river would disperse, making it impossible for the river to reach its destination. In the same way, the life force would dissipate itself in endless and innumerable ways, were it not confined between the two poles of the opposites. These banks of the river of life are best looked upon not as two parallel lines, but as two converging lines that meet at the point of liberation. The amount of oscillation becomes less and less as the individual approaches the goal and completely subsides when he realizes it. It's like the movement of the doll that has its center of gravity at the base, with the result that it has a gradual tendency to become steady in the sitting posture. If shaken, it continues to swing from side to side for some time, but each movement covers a shorter span, and in the end, the doll becomes stationary. In the case of cosmic evolution, such subsiding of alternation between the opposites means Mahapralaya, and in the spiritual evolution of the individual, it means liberation. How are we doing on time? Okay, we are almost out of time, and there's more to do. Okay, so I think we will stop here and maybe take any questions for coverage right away. Questions or comments? So I take that as
No.
Just think about if you kill, you want to experience the whole thing, and you have this tendency of getting killed by either someone with similar sanskaras or I don't know, whatever. It's a bit scary. Could somebody throw some light on it?
If you don't identify with the body, I think if you look at all the spiritual literature, this is karma. Of course, everything I say is my understanding. That I think the fear of death is because of the false identification with the body. Gross body, I am Tendulkar. Subtle body, I am Rahman. Mental body, I am Dr. Abdul Kalam. This false identification happens only during the waking state. So the way I have been coping with life was before I came into Baba, I had a totally different personality. I was afraid, then all kinds of phobias. Now I had only two choices, either surrender to the fear or say, let me understand what is life, who am I? So today you're seeing me the way I am. And so Rajneesh said a beautiful thing, that the soul, we all are alive right now, we are breathing, and we always feel that we are immortal, we are not going to die, even though we know there is something called death. And he said, you know what? The thing that tells you that you're immortal is your real I self, the drop soul Atma. So, but technically, the gross body drops, not the subtle body or the mental body. So again, this is a form of sanskaric conditioning that makes us fear, somebody. And I've seen that many times. There are certain people with whom you can't get along, and there are certain karmic connections. So that is how I look at the whole thing. That is, this word false identification is a very important concept of discourses and God speaks. Jai Baba.
Does that answer your question, Namita?
Not really.
No,
Yeah,
not
your
really.
face said it. So that's why I asked.
We can have a session for an hour for the typical market trades, the psychology. I'm just kidding.
Okay, it's
It's a
okay.
very deep topic,
I have no intention of either killing or getting killed, so I think it's not applicable. I can
Yeah, so I
let it
think
go.
your sanskaric framework makes you react that way. But, the fact that the opposite has to be experienced is an unfailing and automatic aspect of how this works. So if in some birth you had to do one of the two, either being killed or kill, then its counterpart samskara has to be experienced, and then there's no getting away from it. So you're reacting in this way because your samskaras are different in this birth, in this drop soul.
Yeah,
I think
that's
another angle to look at it is like if you want to go beyond samskaras, if you have read God Speaks and understood the concept, on a top-down approach, this is a divine movie. We are all actors. So we have to play every role, the opposites of experience, also being a male or female, born in the East or West, because this is how the divine law is designed. That is why I believe it is so important to read the God Speaks and Discourses to understand how it affects our life. Again, I emphasize pure love is the gift of the perfect master. One can't just depend on love unless it becomes pure. Till then, we have to keep using all the scaffolding and understanding of these concepts, why these things happen. So it is an imagination. This is God's divine imagination from which we have to wake up. So that is the whole point, that there is nothing like fear. It's all imagination only in the waking state. When you go to sleep, you don't exist. That's it. It's the divine absolute vacuum. There are only two states for a human being. One is state one of God, the divine absolute vacuum, 8 hours of sound sleep state, and the waking state of 16 hours where you are either doing unintelligent action or intelligent action. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba. Thank you.
Can I have a question here? So,
Sure.
what is the status of value systems in the society as good and bad when you compare it to positive and negative samskaras, one ablating the other one? So, how do we say put them together? So, you are trying to inculcate all good, positive, or say behaviors or values in the value system. But if you are doing only that good, how do you apply the bad? As per this,
It's a long answer, and I think Kama has referred to this multiple times. In fact, if I remember right, Kama said this is one of the things that drew him to Baba, and in personal interactions also he said it, right? The fact that Baba expounds the bad as being nothing but the lesser of good, right? And the way he handles morals is different, and the right way, the only way, is different from what we have grown up with in our learnings, right? In society, as per law, as per religion, and everything. And I think that's something that's a profound thing that we have to adjust, to use the word, and get used to it. So with that, I'll leave it to Kama.
I think to add what you said and what even Ashok said in the beginning, I use the acronym LOSS: love, obedience, surrender, sacrifice. When we don't have the guidance of a perfect master, Then we have to go through trial and error, reading all the good books, having the right intention. And then fortunately, one has the grace of a perfect master. Now, this is where the real journey starts. Now, Baba has said in Discourses, as we know from the spiritual infinity of the truth, that the morals that society has created is very relative. It has nothing to do with the spiritual world. So the best way to do it is the provisional working ego and what is said in my wish. Just surrender to Baba that you are an actor and the director is telling you, and as long as you're sincere. So there are two aspects. One is using the mind, which is the analytical reasoning mind, but above the analytical reasoning mind is heart intuition. I think this is what the world needs today, that we have to go beyond the analytical reasoning mind to awaken the heart intuition. And this can happen through either understanding Advaita Vedanta without the grace of a perfect master, or now we have Baba in our life. Just surrender. Even if you do something that you feel that, I've done something bad, surrender to Baba. Baba said, give me your good, bad, and ugly, everything 100%, and I will take care of it. So that is the easiest answer for a very, very complicated question, because it is a very important quintessential question. So don't even use your mind, because this mind is only during the waking state, if you remember, and we are all actors trying to follow the book of rules. Sometimes we play with sportsman spirit, sometimes we create penalties. So think of it as a ball game, the Baba ball game of love. So I have to take it as a joke, this is all a joke, it's in God's imagination, so let's not take it serious. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
Does that answer your question, Mama?
No, I'm further confused. Anyway, let me ponder over it.
Karthik, you should not let Mama be by himself. I think you have to keep him busy. I've got a lot of assignments for him to keep him busy, So maybe we should talk about it later.
Sure.
Jai Baba. I also feel sad because all of you all have studied so much, doctors, PhDs, this and that. And then when we move to the next life, all of that finishes. You have to start from zero. Is there a way we can carry this?
And go to the opposite of this also.
Yeah, I want to see whether some of these degrees can go to the next life as well.
No, what we go through will be the opposite of that. So ignorant, illiterate soul to
and Kamaji will lose all his acronyms. Then he has to start again.
Nomita, to answer your question on a technical sense, Baba has talked about this in Discourses. If you remember, in probably reincarnation and karma, every individual's when they take a new birth, they begin where they ended in their last life. So when we go into the astral world, we actually have a flashback of all the things we did in our past life, and then we are guided by so-called angels and blah blah blah, and we come with a pre-scripted plan. So my understanding of life is the big picture we don't control. Who you marry, what kind of children you have, these are all pre-scripted. But what you do in between, like as Krishnamurti said, the only thing in life you can do is brush your teeth better than the last time you did. So that kind of explains what is fate, destiny, and what is free will and power of choice. So this is just a game. You are already full of love. All of us have love. We are human beings. What prevents us is the ego, Manonash. So let's not focus on love. Focus on Manonash. That is my suggestion. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba, thank you.
Jai Baba. Sorry, this stretched way beyond, but I think it was important
We've gone beyond budget today.
Yeah, way beyond, way beyond. But we still didn't answer Mama's question. He'll ponder. So
Mama has an assignment today, and Saturday, Sunday I may not come because I have a history of doing no homework.
Can still come.
Can I say something?
Up top.
Last, I wanted to say something. If it's just 1 minute. So
sure.
There's this few lines which is also enigmatic, and that can be a third homework, or at least if not a homework, at least a thought. these banks of the river of life are best looked upon not as two parallel lines, but as two converging lines that meet at the point of liberation.
Yeah,
So,
that was a
is
brilliant
it that we are going back to the ocean? We come back from the ocean and go back to the ocean.
Yeah.
Point
Yes.
to ponder.
Very nice. Jai Baba, thank you.
Thank
Jai
you.
Baba.
Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody, and have a good night, Ravi. See you all tomorrow. Jai Baba.
Jai
Jai
Baba.
Jai
Jai
Baba.
Baba,
Have a
everyone.
great day.
Jai Baba. Have a good day. Yeah.